Gentlemen, this is Democracy Manifest. And you, sir, are you waiting to receive my limp penis?
The UK had some local council elections last week, and the results were mixed at best. Sorry, cat's attacking me already. Sorry, I have to chuck the criminal out before I get started.
Gentlemen, this is Democracy Manifest.
Sorry, so the local election results were mixed at best. On the one hand, the Labour Party was decimated, which is undeniably very funny. Keir Starmer's kind of self-actualised as the Kirk Van Houten of British politics.
Can I borrow a feeling? Could you lend me a jar of love?
Desperate to keep sleeping in the big bed at number 10 while the world's slowest guillotine descends to decapitate his political career. While we did see the embarrassing performance from Labour, we also saw some solid gains from the Green Party, despite the histrionic media tantrums over Green leader Zach Polanski's time as an agency worker, or his failure to pay a council tax, which the council doesn't even bother enforcing, while living on a houseboat.
Why buy a house when ye can buy a houseboat?
We also saw a coordinated, mind-numbing campaign against the Greens as a hothouse of anti-Semitism, which may have undermined their performance slightly, despite the gains. On the other hand, the Labour humiliation and Green gains were overshadowed by a surge in support for the far-right Reform Party, led by rotten flesh muppet Nigel Farage. While the Greens were the subject of most of the intense media scrutiny, Reform were able to fly under the radar and elect several candidates with explicitly Nazi politics. I'm not being trite. Explicitly Nazi politics. One candidate, Nathaniel Mendy, describes the Nazis as, quote, real visionaries, and wanted to fly the neo-Nazi symbol, the Sonnenrad, as part of his local football team, Sheffield United's flag. Another elected councillor, Andrew Mahon, claimed that British fascist leader Oswald Mosley was 100% right, while another, Ben Rowe, claimed that Jews are responsible for, quote, creating division by forcing other races on our society, and said immigrants are, quote, breeding like rats. Other gems included Stuart Pryor, who called white people the master race, and Glenn Gibbons, who said that Nigerians should be melted down to fill in potholes. And this is hardly a comprehensive list either. There are more examples to cite, and these people, they weren't quiet in the run-up to the election. A media which genuinely cared about anti-Semitism and not about instrumentalising fears in the pursuits of right-wing politics might have been able to pick up on Britain's highest polling political party standing several explicit Nazis in local elections. Instead, however, it's Zach Polanski's mild anti-Zionism which is the real threat, alongside the Palestine solidarity demonstrations. Beyond just the Nazis, which not a nice phrase to say, but beyond just the Nazis, another story which has received an absurdly low level of coverage in comparison to Polanski's houseboat and his agency worker scandals was Nigel Farage receiving a £5 million payout from a crypto billionaire that he refused to declare. A bribe, if you will, or a reward. But what's clear from discrepancies like this is that for establishment forces, for the media, for dominant politics, the Green Party is a far bigger threat to their interests than Reform. And this becomes especially clear when you examine the specific politics of Reform. You may think, well, these are fascists and the neoliberals are against the fascists. Alongside the obvious major policy, which is just, racist anti-migrant politics, Reform is basically pushing Thatcherite neoliberal politics. It takes millions of pounds of donations from oil interest, which accounts for around 2/3 of its financial backing, which can be understood as part of its healthy opposition to any kind of net zero politic and its pro-fracking policy. Incidentally, despite their opposition to net zero, it's about 50% of Reform voters are actually in favour of net zero. Part of this is because they have a lot of farming constituencies, and farmers are quite attuned to the problems of climate catastrophe. We've already seen massive failures, crop failures across the world because of changes in climate, and this is going to happen in the UK as well, and is already happening in the UK as well. So there are actually elements of Reform's constituency that are more I don't want to say progressive, more concerned with climate catastrophe than the Green Party, than Reform are as a whole. So while Reform are pro-fracking, which has obviously been associated with like long-term health impacts on affected communities, that's not necessarily reflected wholesale by their support. And so while other less fascist branches of neoliberalism emphasise the necessity of renewable investment for energy security, Reform are kind of stuck with a Thatcherite perspective of national oil as the only possible route to like national energy security, which is a framework obviously tied in together with national security, which is again tied in with their migrant politics. But this support for oil also places them alongside powerful forces in British politics, and is constitutive of a particularly reactionary tendency of the far right, which sees climate politics as, I don't know, gay or whatever. Reform are also committed to a contradictory policy of pursuing similar levels of tax cuts as Liz Truss pursued in her famously disastrous tenure as Prime Minister, which, you know, lasted less time than a head of lettuce. What was it, like 45 days, 47 days? It's very silly. But while Liz Truss aligned herself against the sort of technocratic elements of the neoliberal state, like the central bank and the Office of Budget Responsibility, Reformed have somewhat aligned themselves with that dominant political bloc by recently recommitting their support for such neoliberal institutions, like their support of the OBR and their support of an independent Bank of England. Both of these structures have the power to effectively discipline the state around tax cuts, and that's exactly what happened in the case of Liz Truss. While her governmental programme was clearly like immensely reactionary, like neoliberalism on steroids, we on the left have to be quite careful not to naturalise its failure as a kind of inevitability of the natural forces of the economy. Well, of course, Liz Truss' economics failed. It was silly economics. But it wasn't a natural force. It was a political struggle. It was essentially an intra-elite struggle between reactionary executive branch and the unaccountable state financial bodies. And crucially, these financial bodies would be essential in disciplining and delegitimizing any left politics that went against the grain too. So I think the left does have to be careful when we're talking about reform, and there's kind of, you see people talk about their economic illiteracy and stuff like that, but the Bank of England and the narratives of economic orthodoxy are really easy to assume and become sort of sucked into from the left from that perspective as well, which ends up just co-opting any kind of insurgent politics. And I kind of think that that's clear in Andy Burnham, who's going to be challenging Keir Starmer for leadership, assuming he wins this by-election, which is a whole other thing. But his recent recommitment to the OBR and to the strict financial rules of Rachel Reeves are kind of in that same game. He's trying to play a game of committing himself to economic orthodoxy so he doesn't get, media criticism for being out of the grain, too crazy left-wing. Andy Burnham died in the world new labourist. Hardly a goddamn fucking force of the left. But he's still playing that game of legitimising these constitutional bodies of basically economic and financial disciplining. He's basically demonstrating that he is a safe pair of hands for orthodoxy. And it's also, unclear to me how Reform aims to overcome this tension as well, or whether they just want to slot themselves into a neoliberal orthodoxy which is content with becoming increasingly fascistic towards migrants, racial minorities, women and queer people. But what's clear is that this programme is less threatening to the neoliberal state than that of the Greens. I wonder if there's any historical precedents that we can draw on. But of course, the defining feature of Reform UK, the one which produces Nazi councillors, is their racist anti-migrant politics. In the context of a climate collapse, the spectre of increasing flows of climate refugees is only going to intensify this racist politics, which is a scary thought in the context of Reform's existing pledges to expand detention on repurposed military sites and scale up charter flights for removal of up to 600,000 people. So that's the creation of concentration centres and mass deportations of people who might not even, people who have indefinite leave to remain, people who are at this point legal migrants. And as I've spoken about in other videos, this isn't so much a break with neoliberal border regimes which have utilised increasingly harsh militarised techniques to organise and filter labour, defining some groups as more assimilatable or, more human, and others as less so. And you can see the consistency between neoliberal and far-right articulations of border politics by looking at Labour's current migration policy, which has utilised the hard border to make crossings harder, to filter and organise labour more extremely, and which people expect Andy Burnham, the left hope for Labour, to maintain. So you can see there is deep neoliberal commitment to hard border regimes, which is productive of fascistic articulations. And I've spoke about this in relation to Palantir's supervillain manifesto in my last video, and it's not a coincidence that Reform's head of policy, the far-right Christian theologian James Orr, is actually also close friends with Palantir's Peter Thiel. There is a network of far-right elites coalescing around civilizational discourses of the superiority of the West and its destruction under a flood of barbarous migrants. It's an elite concentration of fascism, essentially. As an aside, by the way, Orr and Thiel are also friends with Paul Marshall, who owns GB News, and is the father of ex-Mumford & Sons banjo player Winston Marshall. And for some JTD lore, I do take some credit for breaking up Mumford & Sons after sparking a Twitter onslaught against Winston for being a far-right embarrassment, which led the very next day to them breaking up. My tweet was featured in the news stories about it. So, you're welcome.
Weep, little lion man, you're not as brave as you were at the start.
And if you would like to support such important work, my Patreon and PayPal are in the description. But, like I say, these hard border politics are consistent with general neoliberal tendencies. We can see a clear example of this in some recent, quite bleak news. Why do I even specify bleak? Everything's bleak. Last week, the 46 members of the European Council signed a political declaration which makes it easier for members of the European Court of Human Rights, that's member states that are signed up to that, to deport migrants, even in cases where doing so would be unsafe for the migrant. This actually does perhaps go against global human rights regimes, so there is a tension there. But it's not a wholesale destruction of migrant rights in Europe. What it is a part of a general trend, a general tendency towards increasingly harsh and dehumanizing human rights regimes and migration regimes. And this does link to something that I've written about in my forthcoming book for University of London Press, and that is the fascistisation of human rights. While the far right often signals an antipathy towards human rights frameworks, whether that's reforms, and James Orr's specifically attack on activist human rights lawyers who block their ability to deport whoever they want, or whether it's Trump's withdrawal from global human rights regimes, human rights institutions, citing the drifting of the UN's core mission, which now instead acts contrary to the interests of the United States while attacking our allies and propagating anti-Semitism, which is, a clear strategic alignment with Israel as they commit their genocide and a deliberate delegitimization of things like the ICJ as they're potentially prosecuting Israel. But there's also been a trend whereby far-right forces take the critique that human rights are a product of Western, Enlightenment values. And the critique often is like, well, these are racist in their conception because of their dehumanizing aspects. They're a product of Western influences, which is true in many senses. I don't think it's 100% the case because of, human rights are a contested field, and I can get into that in another video. But the far right, instead of saying, oh no, these actually are universal, are taking the critique and saying, actually, yes, human rights are actually the product of a superior Western culture and therefore should only be applied to national, white, Western subjects. The failure of the human rights system is warped into a failure of international human rights not respecting indigenous, white European culture, which is now under threat from, swarms of global south migrants. So it's a kind of inversion of the critique, a critique of the critique that ends up being deeply reactionary. For example, Geert Wilders in the Netherlands and Le Pen in France have both positioned themselves as defenders of human rights of women and LGBTQ people against a kind of Orientalist threat of backwards Muslim invaders. Mirroring the discussion of good and bad immigrants, the far right invokes good human rights of restraining state power against the bad human rights which protect migrants and minorities. And we can once again see the continuities between the far right, Nazi-infested sludge of Reform UK and Palantir and the neoliberal ideological construction of material border regimes. So what the mixed bag results of the UK's local elections really demonstrate is that on the one side there's a clear appetite for progressive alternatives to the neoliberal fascist convergence. But that appetite is subject to a hysterical media environment which sees progressive reform as a far less appealing option than far-right, Nazi-infested intensifications of the neoliberal status quo. For those of us on the communist left, the strategy should be quite clear. Clear-eyed opposition to border regimes, nationalism and the imperial mode of living which is driving the climate catastrophe. While I'm by no means advocating communists become embroiled in liberal social democratic electoralism, I think it's quite clear that we need to be identifying those progressive constituencies that are voting for parties like the Greens and finding ways to sharpen and radicalise them, burst them out of the electoral sphere, expand their anger beyond just bourgeois politics. It may be hack to repeat Rosa Luxemburg's famous dictum, but every day it just becomes clearer and clearer that in the era of climate catastrophe, the options truly are socialism or barbarism. My channel couldn't survive without all of the amazing Patreon support that I get every month from patrons starting at $2 a month all up to $10 a month. So if you enjoyed this video, if you liked the analysis, if you liked the fact that I broke up Mumford & Sons, and yes, I am extending that to from contributing to the breakup to saying that I actively did it. It's me, I did that, you're welcome, sign up to Patreon. I hope you enjoyed this video. Quick sort of reflection on the current events of the UK's spiralling political system. I'm trying to get some more videos out more often, so videos like this that reflect on current events are probably going to become more common. I'm working on a couple bigger projects at the moment, including one on the neoliberal fascist nexus, as well as one on AI and machines, looking back at some of Marx's writing on automation. So if you'd like to keep up, please like, subscribe, share, join Patreon for as low as $2 a month. You get access to videos early, you get access to all the scripts. For $5 and up, you get access to a Discord, and $10 and up get their names read out in the credits, which I will do just now. So thank you to all my beautiful patrons on the $10 and up tier. Demo Squid, Soval Hayes, Anita Anisbe, Bonbon, Cameron Blakemore, Daniel Swing, Earl Grey T, Ellis Wren, FD Signifier, Hey Joe, Joshua Moldenhauer, Catherine Helm, Katie Marshall, Kim Crawley, Nina G Public Relations, S, Unoriginal Name, Violet, Aga Ghost, Aaron, Alex, Borland Rice, Kate Soiree, Christopher Puff, Daniel Hughes, Duncan Skinner, Esoteric Fictionalism, Eugene K, J Fraser Cartwright, Jack, Jacob Quinn Schenker, Joel, G.R. Barbera, Casper Gunder Westbark Larson, Kieran Gore, Layum, Mason Colbert, Melanie Estes, Margussis, Margussi, Niels Abelgard, Paul Singleton, Via Westphal, Practical Woman, Rachel Ann, Rachel Mixon, Robin, Tamash Kispeter, TB Skyan, Tim, Tinfoil Pancakes, Tom Price, and Xander Corvus. I like to try and get as good at that as I can. Today's was not quite as good, but hey, if you want to see if I can add your name in fucking easily, fucking smoothly, then feel like signing up to $10 and up patrons. And if not, liking, sharing, watching, subscribing, all that stuff, or a one-off donation via PayPal. All the description in the links. Love you all. Bye.
What is the charge? Eating a meal? A succulent Chinese meal?